Hey everyone, welcome to lesson 14. Let me get some notes up because there's a lot to dive into today. So, lesson 14 is focused on innate non-specific defenses, and we're going to go through what is your body's basic defenses into how that works with your microbiome, and then we're going to go over some cells and kind of bridge into instead of just being focused on innate non-specific defenses to getting a little bit more specific. There's a lot to go through with this lesson, so we're going to just jump right into it. So, how does your body defend itself against outside attackers, whether it is bacteria or parasites or viruses? And you might think of all the different, immune cells you have, but one of the basic things that we typically ignore is the natural barriers we have. So the first is going to be skin. So if you get a cut or something, it is more likely to get infected. And the reason for that is your skin is a wonderful barrier against bacteria, viruses, and everything else. So it's relatively, microbiologically speaking, very thick. It is keratinized with all of these dead cells that build up and move to the surface and then slough off. So they are creating this barrier of dead cells that can't actually get infected because they're dead, which is really, really nice. And then under that is all the live cells that can get infected, but also you have some other defenses interwoven in your skin as an entire bodily organ. Now, that is when we're talking about your outward facing skin. When we talk about your mucose membranes, that is your inward facing skin, for lack of a more basic term. This is going to be, your mouth, your intestines, your lungs. So all of that is still a skin membrane, as it were. It's this outward facing membrane, but it is more susceptible to infections because you don't have that dead cell layer that's giving you this protection from infection by just having a innate non-functional cell buildup that's blocking everything. And this leads to issues like respiratory tract infections, getting, mouth infections and stuff like that, getting colonization in those areas. It's also warm and inside you, so we can't wash it. So if you get one of those infections, your other innate immune systems have to clear that out. But the reason they're called mucous membranes is because they produce this thick mucus that actually traps invading microorganisms, and then you cough it up or you sneeze it out, and that expels them. So when we're thinking about bacterial infections that actually infect our lungs, for instance, a lot of that is removed through the act of coughing, or if it's in our sinuses, through the act of sneezing, and all of those not so nice things that happen when you're sick. So the mechanical defenses with these physical barriers are going to be that mucus creation in your mucose membranes. It is going to be this physical action of coughing, sneezing, vomiting in the case of your intestines, diarrhea. Those are all ways that we expel microbes. And along with that expulsion, we can think of saliva as a way of expulsing those microbes. And tears are the same thing. If you get an eye infection, you'll cry a lot. Or if you just get, something in your eyes, you cry a lot. And that's so you can get those different pathogens out. But then there is one more thing that's really cool about the lungs in particular. You have these little tiny cells that kind of act as little brushes that will like brush up the mucus and force it out in a cough or uh, phlegm, things like that. So there's a lot of cellular defenses as well that are additional operations that those cells have, plus just being a part of your mucosal lining. Now, when we think about these sort of basic defenses we have, they're also always colonized by some sort of other microbiota. On your skin, you have tons of microbes living, and inside your lungs and inside your stomach, you have a ton of microbes living. So it's really important to keep those things, those microbes in a balance. And this is what we get into when we start talking about the microbiome, how important it is. So one of the microbiome residents that a lot of people have that actually helps maintain a protective conditioning in your stomach is lactobacillus. So that will sit there and it will actually prevent infections of your intestines. A lot of these microbes actually produce antimicrobial agents that kill other microbes. So if you have a stable microbiome, it is more difficult for outside different sources to come in and those pathogens actually take over and colonize you because you're already colonized by these happy, healthy, helpful microbiome species. Now, we also have a set of chemical based and enzyme based defenses. So these are things that are secreted by cells. Generally, it's going to be mucosal membranes. And these are secreted to act as an additional barrier almost, but an active barrier, not the passive barrier that's just like your skin cells. One example of this is lysozyme. This is in your tears and saliva. It breaks down bacterial cell walls. It lyses them. So lyse meaning to break open. So it actually breaks open bacteria, and that's one way that all of that bacteria is prevented from, living in your mouth at all times or living in your eyes at all times and just overly colonizing. Another thing that we secrete is sebum and earwax. So this creates a similar to the lungs, a thick mucose-like environment that all of these things will get trapped in, and at some point they will get dispelled. So earwax happens in your ears. Sebum just happens on your skin. If you've ever, not taken a shower, it's late in the day and you're all oily, that's actually going to be sebum. And when it builds up, it builds into whiteheads and things like that. We also have things called defensins. These are peptides that naturally disrupt microbial membranes. So peptides are very short proteins that don't have a tertiary structure. So they're just a solid link without folds, uh, typically. Like everything in science, it's typically like that. There's a couple other different versions of this. There's complement proteins that will tag pathogens for destruction. There's interferons, which are cytokines that they will also do a similar tagging and kind of warn the immune system overall that, like, hey, something's wrong in this area that needs to be taken care of. Then we move on to what we more classically think of as the innate immune system, which is going to be the different cells that circulate in your blood and in your lymph system. So one of those is neutrophils. These are little cells that circulate in your blood and your lymphatic system, and they actually just go in and they rapidly phagocytose or gobble up pathogens, and they eat them, and then they go, do I think this is bad? Yes, let me present it to the rest of the immune system. Like, let's check in this big bureaucracy of immune cells and say, hey, do you guys recognize this? Talking to the other cells that, are our adaptive immune system that recognize different pathogens we've been infected with previously. So they take those, present them, and then, it cascades from there. Or they just present and they say, does this look dangerous? And if the answer is yes, then they'll keep phagocytosing, they'll eat it all up, and they'll destroy it. Macrophages are what we would term these longer lived, more robust consumers. So macrophages are typically going to clear out everything that is debris within your system, whether that is your own dead cells, whether that is viruses or bacteria. It's going to come in and it can wholly consume those and say, this is, normal. It's a dead cell. I'm just going to process this into its base components and recycle it. Or, this looks really different. I think this is a bacteria. Let me throw up some warning signals to the adaptive immune system. So those are two that just go around and they are eating. Similar to these, we have dendritic cells. So these cells are usually depicted as kind of spider-like. They have a lot of arms coming out of them, and they're used to sense the environment very thoroughly and then act like macrophages, where they grab and then they're the ones that typically take and present the cells in your lymph nodes to your adaptive immune system. Your dendritic cells are going to take those, transport them along, and say, "Hey, everybody that's just hanging out, is this bad?" And if the answer is yes, then all your B cells and T cells start activating, and then on that adaptive side, you get a response. Now, eosinophils and basophils slash mast cells, these are typically associated with allergies, but their normal purpose is actually to attack parasites and trigger inflammation, especially eosinophils on the parasite side. So they release granulocytes. All of these cells release granulocytes, which are all these little things that attach to what would be a parasitic cell wall and mark it for death, essentially. So, mark it for consumption by things like macrophages and dendritic cells. That's the very, very simple version. If you look at the webs of how all these cells work and all of their subtypes, it's really interesting, really overwhelming. Every cell has many, many subtypes underneath it. So I'm being pretty broad, but that's typically what they do. So basophils and mast cells, they're the ones that are releasing histamine, which we associate with allergies, and this triggers widespread inflammation. So hay fever, back in the day, everyone would, get really sick when hay was being harvested and coming through the season, and that fever is because all of these cells are releasing a ton of histamine. You actually do get a fever and feel terrible, and some people died from it because we didn't have basic medicine back in the, 16, 17, 1800s to mediate this. And now today we just, pop a Zyrtec or an Allegra or whatever it is, and you don't have this issue because those guys, that histamine release is being controlled. Um, so like I said, these cell types are all doing a specific job, but they kind of lump into different groups. There's the eaters, there's the markers, and then there's one other type. These are natural killer cells. And these are specifically for killing virus infected abnormal cells. So they go around, they circulate, and they see, hey, this cell is off. I'm going to kill it. And in microbiology, they kill virus infected cells typically. Sometimes they'll kill bacterial infected cells. But one of the other things that they do is they kill cancer cells. So if you have a cell that just is operating very weirdly, they can recognize that and they could say, I need to kill this. Typically, the expansion of them and widespread killing by them has to be mediated by that adaptive side. You can think if it was just going around detecting and killing cells all the time indiscriminately, you could have a very bad autoimmune disease because they are just killing a ton of your cells, especially if it doesn't understand how to mark them. So natural killer cells are in this middle area where they're kind of adaptive, they're kind of innate, and for the purposes of the class, we move them into the innate side. So you have your eaters, your markers, and in this case, one killer cell, and that's your natural killer cell. Um, when we look at migration and recognition, so all of these cells will have to, of course, migrate to the area that you're infected, and they will have to then recognize what's going on. So leukocytes, which include neutrophils and macrophages and dendritic cells, they can actually squeeze through the walls of blood vessels and enter into the tissue. You actually have tissue resident macrophages. So just in your skin, they're there. And if you get a cut or something that starts to get infected, they're the ones that are on it. They're there. They start saying, hey, hey, something's going on here. And then they'll pull more macrophages and neutrophils from outside that are circulating in your bloodstream into that area, and that's actually one of the things inflammation does is it says we need more cells here to fight something that's going on, and that's why you have an area that's red and itchy and raised and warm is because it's inflamed, and it's it's not a great experience, but it's important for marking where all these cells need to go. And inflammation is a very broad term. It doesn't really say how, on a molecular level, this is occurring, but it occurs through what we call chemotaxis. So, chemochemical taxis, taxi is how I think about it. And this is a chemical signal that's released by microbes or damaged cells or these innate immune cells that say, hey, we need help over here. And that is actually the first step that results in both inflammation and then recruitment of other innate immune cells and adaptive immune cells to get into that area. Then when we go to the recognition side, so that we were talking about migration, now for recognition, how does a cell know that there is something bad here versus it's my own cell? And the answer to that is something called pathogen associated molecular patterns, or PAMPs. This is just something you wouldn't find on your own cells, that you'll only find in a microbe that's trying to infect you. This could be, obviously, we don't have cell walls. A lot of bacteria does have a cell wall. So if all these cells see a cell wall from a bacteria, it goes, I don't have cell walls. That's not supposed to be here. Let's all kill it together. So these PAMPs, these pathogen associated molecular patterns, are how our innate cells are going to recognize the microbes. Now, as I talked about a little bit earlier, we have this group of phagocytosing or eating, consuming innate cells. This is our neutrophils, our macrophages, and our dendritic cells. And they are going to be the majority of the cell types that are actually mediating all of the immune response. So they're the ones that show up first, they're the ones that eat, they're the ones that present to the adaptive immune system. So how this works is the steps of phagocytosis start with, again, that chemotaxis, that uh, movement of the phagocytic cell into where the microbes are and actually coming into contact with them. Then we have what we call adhesion and engulfment. So the way it works is your cell, you kind of open up your cell membrane and then grab whatever the pathogen is. And this is a operation that takes the pathogen into the innate cell in a vesicle. Then you have it trapped in, cell jail. So it's in its little jail compartment, and then you have a phagosome form. This is another vesicle that is specifically for encasing the microbe. So this is a very complex process, but you have that engulfment, and then the phagosome is when it's actually fully inside the innate cell that is phagocytizing the microbe. Then you get what we call a liposome. So lipases, they split apart membranes, and that liposome fuses into the phagosome, forming a phagolysosome. And that fusion releases a bunch of enzymes that degrade whatever is in there. So if in the case of a macrophage, you're taking in a dead cell or cancer cell, you still go through this process. It breaks it down into base parts that are recycled. If it is a virus, same process. It goes in, it breaks it down to base parts, and those actually oftentimes get recycled because it's the base building blocks of life. We can use that on a cellular level. Same with bacteria. Same with even something like a virus, or sorry, not a virus, a parasite. Those are a lot bigger. So depending on what it is and how the parasite works, this doesn't necessarily happen. Parasites are very, very complex, and they have a lot of defenses of their own because they are more complex. But you get that fusing and then digestion. And that's when the enzymes destroy the microbe. And once you do that, the debris is then expelled. Some of it might be taken for recycling, but most of the times, once an infection scenario, actually that debris is expelled to say, look at all this stuff that I just ate. This is dangerous. Know what this looks like, all the other cells around me. And then that kicks on more inflammation, more cells coming, more cells looking at that and saying, this is a PAMP, that pathogen associated molecular pattern. I need to be aware of that. And I need to kill more stuff that has that on it. And like I said, this is where you get inflammation. So inflammation is defined as redness, heat, swelling, and pain. And we've all experienced inflammation. It is not great. It's oftentimes triggered by histamine release. So there are a lot of inflammatory processes. The main one is histamine release, but there are other pathways for that. So you might read that it's histamine that causes inflammation, but that's generally in the context of allergies, not in the context of how inflammation on a grand scale is triggered. There are many, 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 many ways to trigger inflammation. And what this does, again, is it causes that chemotaxis sort of loop. So chemotaxis triggers inflammation, which triggers chemotaxis, which brings more cells, and it starts this cycle of getting cells into that space. In a wound, you might have pus. like a whitehead or something like that, and that's actually white blood cells and microbes and tissue debris and everything else all congealed together, and it looks white for the most part. Um, and that is actually just the evidence that your body is doing what it should be, and there has been a battlefield here that now there's just buildup of all these dead cells, and that is what pus is. Now, the issue with this, you might be thinking, is, well, how does this stop? How do you stop this inflammation cycle? And the way to stop it is with that adaptive immune side that we're not going to talk about right now. But the adaptive immune system has a lot of built-in triggers that say, whoa, 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 we're too sick. We have too much inflammation. We need less cells active in this space. And that's why during disease, you might have disease and then you actually get rid of the disease, but you still feel sick for a day or two, and then you start coming down. If you have something like tuberculosis and chronic inflammation, that means your adaptive immune system plus your innate immune system hasn't been able to clear that infection. So you keep ramping up inflammation and it starts to come down. You ramp it up again because your infection is still there. So your body's trying to get rid of it, but it just can't. It can't handle it. And then your body, instead of being super inflamed and doing damage to you over the short term, tamps it down, but it always comes back and it gets tamped down again. So it builds, it goes down, builds, it goes down, and you get this chronic damage that ends up happening. Um, so for things like smoking, that damages your lungs a lot, and you do get a lot of inflammation because your cells are dying. You have all this gunk and tar and chemicals that are built up that your body needs to clear out, and it clears that out, and then you smoke again, and more cells die. So you can actually have chronic inflammation from something like smoking or just being exposed to chemicals in the workplace. Like if you're cleaning your bathtub, even, and you use a bunch of chemicals, you can inhale that, and then you can have a cough for a couple days because your lungs are inflamed. You have some cells dying there. And long term, it's not bad. It's really bad when it's chronic. And then realistically, everything else we talk about gets into that adaptive side of how you tamp things down and you control it with cytokines and you reset that inflammation cycle and what that means in different contexts. Like there's infection, but there's also cancer, and we'll get into that in the following lessons. But for this lesson, just focus on learning those innate cell types, learning the general buckets of what they do, and the process of infection going through inflammation, that inflammation cycle, and what that means when you are studying these cells and studying how your body reacts to inflammation and how that aligns with those infection curves we talked about in the last lesson. All right, that's all from me today. I hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you in lesson 15.